On a lonely cliff in Newport, a mansion stands watching the sea, and tonight it is waiting for a maid who does not yet know she is walking into a house of ghosts. Melody Hartwell arrives at Harrow House with nothing but a suitcase and her mother's last letter, warned never to look the master in the eye. Yet behind locked doors, a piano plays in the night, a child cries without words, and a dead woman's secrets press against the walls. When duty demands silence and desire demands courage, which will Melody choose? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And what do you love most about historical romances? Newport, Rhode Island, in the summer of 1890, was a world built upon silks and secrets, where grand mansions clung to the cliffs like jeweled crowns, glittering above the restless Atlantic. Among them stood Harrow House, a vast stone structure with high-arched windows and a cold, unyielding silhouette that seemed carved from the very sea spray. It was toward this imposing residence that Melody Hartwell travelled at the break of dawn, clutching a small trunk, a folded letter, and a heart that beat with equal parts fear and determination. She had spent her life in a modest fishing village, rising before the sun to mend nets and carry water along the rocky shore. Her hands had known the rough grain of wooden boats, the salt of the sea, the weight of survival. Now her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the creases of her mother's last letter, tucked safely in her pocket. It was her anchor, the final remnant of a life swallowed by loss. She carried it close as she climbed the long gravel path leading to Harrow House, each step echoing like a promise she did not yet understand. The front doors loomed before her, carved in dark oak, tall enough to dwarf her entirely. A brass knocker shaped like a lion's head gleamed in the morning light, its polished surface reflecting the pallor of her anxious face. When the doors finally opened, they revealed Mrs. Agatha Pembroke, the housekeeper, a woman of stout frame and severe countenance whose grey curls were tucked beneath a rigid linen cap. "You must be Miss Hartwell," she said, her voice clipped and brisk, as if she had no time for doubt or hesitation. "Follow me. There are rules you must learn before anything else." Melody stepped inside and felt the weight of the mansion settle around her. The air held a faint scent of lavender and old paper. The floors were polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the somber tones of the panelled walls. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her pass, their gazes heavy with judgment. "As a maid of all work, you will carry out tasks in every part of the house," Mrs. Pembroke continued, walking without pause. "You will speak only when required, move quietly, and attend to your duties without question." Melody nodded, absorbing each instruction as they crossed through a long corridor lit by soft morning light, filtering through lace curtains. A chill crept along her spine, not from cold, but from the sensation that she had stepped into a place where silence had been carefully trained to rule. "There is one rule above all," Mrs. Pembroke said, turning sharply. "You must never meet the master's eyes. Mr. Harrow values order and discretion. He does not welcome disruption. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Melody murmured, though something in her heart tightened at the command. She had never feared looking another person in the eye. It was how she understood them, but she swallowed her discomfort and followed the housekeeper deeper into the labyrinth of rooms. They passed a grand staircase draped with a crimson runner that seemed too rich for its own good. At the top of the stairs, a delicate figure watched them. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, stood clutching a small rag doll to her chest. She had pale skin and large blue-grey eyes that shimmered with a quiet sadness. Her light blonde hair was gathered in 2 neat braids, tied with faded ribbons. "This is Miss Eliza," Mrs. Pembroke announced, her tone softening only slightly. "The master's daughter." Eliza did not speak. She simply stared at Melody with the kind of fragile curiosity that made the young maid's heart stir. Melody slowly lowered herself to one knee, careful not to alarm the child. "Hello," she said gently. "It is very nice to meet you." The little girl blinked, her lips parting as if she wished to speak, but no sound came. At her side, Mrs. Pembroke cleared her throat and Eliza instantly straightened, retreating a step. Melody rose to her feet, unsettled by the child's silence, as if it belonged not to youth, but to deep-rooted fear. "The schoolroom is this way," Mrs. Pembroke said firmly, guiding the girl away. Eliza glanced back once, her eyes lingering on Melody with a flicker of longing, then disappeared behind a door. The rest of the day passed in a quiet blur. Melody learned the layout of the house, met the cook, the footman, and the other maids, and received a long list of chores. But the memory of Eliza's eyes followed her through every room. They spoke of loneliness far greater than any child should bear, and Melody's heart ached without knowing why. As evening settled over the cliffs, the mansion grew even more silent. The servants retired early, moving like shadows retreating into darker corners. Melody prepared her small attic room, washed her hands in cold water, and sat for a moment on the edge of her narrow bed. The sea churned below the cliffside, its distant roar reaching the window like a warning. Then, just as she closed her eyes, she heard it, a sound soft enough to be mistaken for wind sliding beneath a door. It began as a barely audible hum, a thin ribbon of melody that drifted through the corridor. Melody rose slowly, drawn by an ache she could not name. She opened her door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. There it was again, a muffled sob, a quiet, trembling cry that seemed to come from behind a closed door on the far end of the floor. Melody's breath stilled. She followed the sound, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, her pulse thrumming with a strange mixture of fear and compassion. When she reached the final door, she realized the melody was not simply a voice. It was music, a haunting, broken tune played on a piano. But when she touched the door, it was locked. She pressed her ear to the wood. The crying continued, and the melody, delicate, mournful, aching, seemed to rise from the very heart of the house. Melody stepped back, her throat tightening, her chest rising with slow, trembling breaths. She had only been in Harrow House for one day, and already she sensed the truth. This was not a home. It was a place filled with shadows, silence, and secrets waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere behind that locked door, a sorrowful soul was calling out to be heard. The sea had turned restless by the second evening of Melody Hartwell's stay at Harrow House. From her narrow attic window, she could see the dark clouds gathering over the Atlantic, heavy and low, as if the sky itself carried the grief that clung to the estate. A breeze rattled the panes with fingers of salt and chill, and somewhere deep within the house, a shutter banged once, then fell still. Inside, the corridors had grown quieter than usual, as if the approaching storm had hushed even the whispers that usually floated between servants' lips. The silver candlesticks flickered against the wallpaper, casting trembling shadows that danced like nervous ghosts across the halls. The day had passed without incident, filled with routine chores and Mrs. Pembroke's ever-watchful gaze. Yet beneath it all, Melody had begun to sense a tension deeper than silence. It was in the way the servants flinched at sudden sounds, in the way no one ever lingered near the West Wing, in the way no one dared to speak the master's name above a whisper. Now, as the hour drew near 7, Melody made her way toward the schoolroom. She carried a small tray, bread with preserves and a cup of chamomile tea sent up at Miss Davenport's terse request. The governess had insisted the child eat alone, and when the cook asked who should deliver the tray, no one volunteered. Melody, out of duty and instinct, stepped forward. She knocked softly, no reply. She turned the handle and entered. The room was bathed in the dim grey of the storm. Curtains were drawn, but the wind pushed against the glass as though determined to be let in. At a small table in the far corner sat Eliza Harrow, perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap. Her pale blue dress, too fine for such a gloomy day, hung stiffly about her, and her hair, tied into 2 precise braids, seemed untouched by play or warmth. "Miss Eliza," Melody said gently, setting the tray down, "the cook sent your supper." Eliza did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, though the curtains blocked the view. Melody hesitated. She had no instructions beyond delivering the tray, but the girl's stillness pulled at her like a current. Something was not right. "Would you like me to stay while you eat?" she asked softly. Still no answer. Then a crack of thunder split the sky. The child flinched, so subtly that one might have missed it, but Melody saw. Her shoulders stiffened, and her hands clutched the fabric of her dress. Another gust of wind moaned against the house, and this time the girl's breath hitched audibly. "Eliza," Melody said again, this time dropping the formality. She moved closer, kneeling beside her with careful grace. "You're safe here." The child's eyes flicked toward her at last, wide, wet, rimmed with the threat of tears she had been taught not to shed. "I'm afraid of the thunder," came the whisper, so faint it might have been imagined. "Mama used to sing when it stormed." Melody's throat tightened. She had not expected the voice to emerge at all, much less laced with such raw, trembling need. Without thinking, Melody reached for the girl's hand. It was cold, trembling slightly in her grasp. She held it gently, anchoring her there. "What did your mama sing?" she asked, her own voice low. Eliza shook her head. "I don't remember the words, only the sound. Soft, like waves." Melody paused. Then she began to hum. It was a melody her own mother had sung when the winds battered their fishing cottage and the sea threatened to devour everything. A lullaby without words, made only of breath and comfort. She let it rise and fall like the tide. No performance, no display, only presence. Eliza let out a shuddering breath. Her grip on Melody's hand loosened just a little, and then, behind them, a door creaked. Melody rose quickly, her heart leaping into her throat. In the doorway stood Lucian Harrow. He was dressed not in a formal coat, but in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his cravat undone, as if he had abandoned his office in haste. His dark hair was damp at the temples, and his steel-grey eyes were fixed on the scene before him. For a moment, no one spoke. Melody stood frozen, her hand still loosely clasping Eliza's. She could feel her pulse thunder in her fingertips. Her instinct screamed at her to release the child, to step back, to drop her gaze to the floor like a proper maid. But something in the silence held her fast. Lucian's expression did not shift. He did not speak, but he looked, truly looked, at Melody, not past her, not through her. It was the first time in her life that such a powerful man had looked her in the eye without condescension or threat. And in that gaze was something she could not name. Not approval, not even curiosity, but a pause, as though something in him had been halted, unmoored. She felt it like a physical force. Behind her, Eliza had turned in her chair and was staring at her father. "I'm sorry," Melody said quietly, her voice steady despite the burn rising in her chest. She was frightened. "I meant no harm." Lucian's jaw flexed. For a moment longer he said nothing. Then at last he gave a slight nod, more gesture than permission, more acknowledgement than dismissal. "I see," he murmured. He stepped back, and the door closed softly behind him. Melody released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eliza clutched her hand once more. "Do you think he was angry?" the girl asked. Melody knelt again, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," she said gently. "I think he was surprised." Downstairs the house stirred. By morning the whispers had begun. Melody heard them in the scullery, in the linen room, even among the footmen whose usual gossip concerned horses and cigars. The new maid sang to the girl. The master saw. She didn't look away. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes narrowed when she passed Melody in the corridor, though she said nothing outright. The air had changed. Melody could feel it in the way people moved around her, as though she had become something unnatural, something seen. But what lingered most was not fear. It was the way Lucian Harrow had looked at her. Not with desire, not with authority, with recognition. And though the storm had passed and the house had returned to its rigid silence, something within Melody had begun to shift. She had been warned never to raise her eyes to the master. But now that she had, she was no longer the girl who had arrived with a single trunk and a folded letter. She was someone who had held a frightened child through a storm, and had been seen by a man no one dared to look at. The morning sun filtered through the east-facing windows of Harrow House with a gentleness that belied the house's cold interior. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals through the still air, suspended like memories no one dared to disturb. Melody moved through the corridors with practiced steps, balancing a small basket of fresh linens. The silence that reigned over the house was not of peace, but of unspoken things, like a breath held too long, like eyes that had wept behind closed doors and never learned to blink again. As she climbed the secondary staircase that led toward the unused wing, a floorboard groaned beneath her heel. She paused, sensing rather than seeing that she had crossed into a space the other servants quietly avoided. The walls here were lined with faded tapestries, and the air grew cooler. Her fingers brushed against the carved banister as she reached the landing, and for a moment she simply stood. The hush was deeper here. She turned to continue her path when a glint of light caught her attention. It came from a door on the left, painted a shade darker than the others, its brass handle dulled with age. It was ever so slightly ajar. That door had always been locked. Melody's breath caught. She looked back down the hallway. Empty. Silent. The housekeeper was occupied in the kitchens. The other maids were far below. And Eliza was still at her morning lesson with the ever-distant Miss Davenport. Drawn by a pull she could neither explain nor resist, Melody set the basket gently against the wall. Her heart beat like a soft warning beneath her apron as she stepped forward and pushed the door open. It creaked, long and low. The room beyond was not large, but it held the kind of intimacy that demanded reverence. A grand piano, veiled in a fine layer of dust, dominated the center like an altar. Its surface had once gleamed, now dulled by years of disuse. A velvet stool stood tucked beneath it, untouched. The wallpaper, blue damask, was faded but elegant. The light from the tall window fell across the room in a single golden ribbon, illuminating a small writing desk and something above it that made Melody's breath catch in her throat. A portrait, unfinished. The brush strokes were delicate but incomplete, the face unmistakably that of a woman with soft eyes and lips pressed in a gentle line. She wore a gown of ivory silk, and her hair was pinned high, with a loose curl falling against her cheek. Melody did not need to ask who she was. Cecilia Harrow. She felt the name like the echo of a cry in a room no longer lived in. This was her space, and it had been left untouched, forgotten by all but the walls that had once absorbed her music and her silence. Her feet carried her forward, slow and reverent. The air here smelled of lavender, long faded. The writing desk beckoned. Its surface bore a thin film of dust, but the inkwell remained, as if waiting. She opened one of the drawers, gently, carefully. Inside were sealed envelopes, tied with a pale blue ribbon. Their paper was yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting on them was still crisp. C.H., written with grace and precision. Melody reached out, but did not take them. The room was not hers. The pain it carried was not hers. And yet, a strange, aching familiarity curled around her ribs. She backed away, heart thudding, lips parted, and as suddenly as she had entered, she turned and slipped out. By the time she returned to her tasks, the air in the house had shifted. The music room lingered at the edge of her thoughts, refusing to let go. That afternoon, while folding linens near the parlor, she felt a soft tug at her skirt. Eliza stood behind her, eyes wide and solemn. "I heard the music room opened," she whispered, her voice barely above breath. "Is it true?" Melody knelt. "It was unlocked when I passed. I didn't mean to intrude." Eliza's eyes shimmered. "My mother played the piano there. I remember a little." Melody's fingers brushed the girl's arm. "Would you like to see it again?" Eliza hesitated, then nodded. But the moment passed quickly. The soft click of Miss Davenport's heels echoed from the hall, and the girl shrank back, her voice disappearing as if it had never existed. Later that week, Harrow House stirred with preparation. A garden gathering had been planned, an event rare and formal, hosted not by Lucian Harrow himself, but at the firm suggestion of Mrs. Adelaide Morton, a widow of immense presence and insatiable ambition. Adelaide arrived wrapped in jewel-toned silk, her gloved hands clutching a fan she wielded like a weapon. Her grey-streaked hair was piled high in the latest Gibson style, her pearls luminous against the curve of her throat. She swept through the house like a duchess, arriving to claim her throne. Melody observed from the periphery. The house had been ordered into unnatural cheerfulness, linen tablecloths laid in the gardens, chilled lemonade served in crystal glasses, a string quartet stationed beneath the arbor. The servants moved with careful urgency, aware that the slightest misstep could summon Mrs. Pembroke's sharp tongue or Adelaide's cooler, more dangerous disapproval. Lucian stood near the rose trellis, dark in his impeccably tailored suit, a figure of detached elegance. His expression was polite but distant. He greeted guests with restrained civility, his smile as practiced as the cut of his coat. When Eliza stepped into the garden in a white muslin dress embroidered with violets, her hand tucked in Miss Davenport's, the crowd offered the child only glances and quiet praise. No one bent down to speak to her. No one noticed the way her fingers tightened at her sides, or how her gaze wandered toward the servants' table. There, under the shade of a linden tree, stood Melody. It was only a moment, but Eliza crossed the garden like a girl drawn to the one place that felt safe. She let go of Miss Davenport's hand and walked straight to Melody, who immediately knelt to meet her. Eliza didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply wrapped her arms around Melody's neck and pressed her cheek to her shoulder. The music stopped. Conversation paused. Eyes turned. Among them, Adelaide Morton's narrowed gaze found its mark. Melody stood slowly, keeping her hand on Eliza's shoulder. She did not smile. She did not apologize. Across the garden, Lucian watched. His glass lowered slightly. The guests exchanged glances. A maid being embraced by a child of such pedigree? Unthinkable, undignified. Melody felt the weight of their judgment, but it passed through her like wind against stone. When Miss Davenport came to retrieve the girl, her lips pursed with disapproval, Eliza clung tighter, but Melody gently released her, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "It's all right," she whispered. Eliza nodded, lips trembling, then allowed herself to be led away. As Adelaide approached Lucian once more, her tone as cool as the silver buttons on her gloves, she murmured just loud enough for the air to carry it. "You'll have trouble with that one." Lucian did not respond. But as Melody returned to her duties, her eyes brushed his for the briefest moment across the garden, and in that glance, not a word was exchanged, but everything changed. For the room that should never have been opened had indeed been opened, and with it, something long asleep had stirred. The wind had changed. It was not just the sea breeze that curled colder through the windows of Harrow House, but something deeper, unseen, unnamed, yet unmistakably present. Melody felt it before she could explain it, in the way the walls seemed to listen, in the way the air pressed against her skin, like the pause between the intake of breath and the inevitable cry. She had returned to the music room. No one had told her to do so. No order had been given, yet some invisible thread tugged her back to that chamber cloaked in dust and forgotten songs. The door had been left ajar again, whether by accident or design, she could not say. The piano stood in its silent vigil. The unfinished portrait of Cecilia Harrow watched with the patience of the dead. The writing desk, quiet and unassuming, called to her like a confession waiting to be heard. Melody's hands trembled as she untied the faded blue ribbon from the bundle of letters she had not dared to touch the last time. The ink had not faded. The paper was still strong. Cecilia's handwriting, elegant, slanted, graceful, curved across the page like the lingering notes of a melody long forgotten. July the 5th, 1889. Edgar came again today. He stayed too long. I saw the shadows in Lucian's eyes when he left. My brother smiles with his mouth and wounds with his tongue. He asked me again to speak to Lucian about the sugar plantations. He says the Harrow fortune cannot rest on shipping alone. But I know his investments are unstable. I know he gambles more than he admits. He thinks I am blind because I am quiet, but I see everything. I tried to say no. He laughed. He said I owe him. He said he could destroy Lucian's name in the city in less than a week. Melody's eyes blurred. Her chest grew tight. He wants my silence, or my persuasion. I am neither sure I can offer. There is something in him now, something I fear, something I don't recognize anymore. He kissed my hand as he left and said, "You'll find your voice when it matters." Melody let the letter fall to her lap. The music room held its breath. Had Cecilia feared her brother more than she trusted her husband? Was that the reason she never cried out? And if so, what had truly led to her death on the cliffs? The next letter in the bundle was shorter, written in haste. August the 2nd, 1889. He came again. This time he brought papers. I didn't sign. But he left them anyway. He said Eliza would be better off with him if I continued to resist. Melody closed the letter slowly. The shadows in Harrow House were not ghosts. They were echoes of threats, of transactions between blood and power, of silence that had cost a woman everything. She returned the bundle to the drawer and left the music room with a weight in her chest that felt impossible to carry. That afternoon she was summoned. Mrs. Pembroke handed her the note with the stiffness of someone who disliked the message more than the messenger. A small folded card in thick ivory stock, bearing no seal, just 2 words scrawled in a fine hand. The library. She found Lucian Harrow alone, standing before the tall arched windows that overlooked the sea. His back was to her. The afternoon light caught in the silver at his temples and cast long shadows across the mahogany floor. Shelves lined the walls, books on navigation, commerce, philosophy. Dust lay in untouched places, as if no one had dared disturb his solitude. "You wish to see me, sir?" Melody asked softly. Lucian did not turn at once. "Close the door," he said. She obeyed, the click of the latch sounding louder than expected. He spoke after a pause. "I've been told you've taken a particular interest in my daughter." Melody's spine straightened. "Only as far as kindness allows, Mr. Harrow. She seeks comfort. I merely offer it." He turned then. His eyes were storm grey, unreadable. "She seeks you, even when she shouldn't." His voice was calm, but there was an undertow to it, subtle and dangerous. Melody lifted her chin. Children recognize warmth, even in places where it's been denied. That struck something in him, a flicker behind his gaze. "I didn't summon you to scold you," he said, lowering his voice. "I summoned you because I wish to understand you." The words startled her more than a reprimand would have. "There's little to understand, sir. I work, I serve, I observe. That is the rhythm of my life." "No," he said, stepping forward, closing the distance between them in a few quiet strides. "You see more than others, and you are not afraid of me." "Why?" Melody's throat tightened. She searched his face, not for cruelty but for grief, and it was there, subtle, controlled, but present, like a sorrow that had learned to dress in velvet and silence. "Because I've seen worse than a man who cannot speak of his pain," she replied. A long silence followed, a silence not of discomfort, but of suspended time. Lucian's voice dropped lower. "You went into the music room." Her breath caught. "Yes, I never reopened it. It was unlocked. Then perhaps it was time." He moved past her, toward the fireplace, where a single candle burned low in its brass holder. "She was not what they said she was," he murmured. "She was quieter, softer. She suffered in ways I didn't know how to fix." Melody found her voice. "She feared your silence more than your anger." He looked up at her sharply. "How do you know that?" She did not answer, but her eyes held his. Something passed between them then, a fragile understanding, a thread connecting two solitudes that had long floated apart. Before either could speak again, the library door opened. A man stepped in, tall, elegant, with golden hair brushed back in perfect waves and a moustache trimmed with precision. He wore a dove-grey coat and gloves of fine leather, and he carried himself like a man born to corridors of power. "Ah," he said, smiling as he removed his gloves. "Lucian, I do hope I'm not interrupting." Lucian's expression shifted at once, controlled, guarded. "Edgar," he said. Melody's heart thudded. The man turned toward her with all the charm of a practiced gentleman. "And you must be the new maid, Miss Hartwell, was it?" She nodded. Edgar's eyes lingered on her just a fraction too long. There was nothing improper in his words, but everything about his gaze made her skin prickle. "Charming," he said. "This house needed fresh blood." Lucian said nothing. Melody lowered her eyes, not out of fear, but to shield her thoughts. She did not trust him. Not his polished voice, nor his gleaming smile, nor the way he said Lucian's name like a shared joke no one else understood. "I'll speak to you later," Lucian said to her. Dismissal. She curtsied and turned to go, but not before Edgar's voice followed her. "Do take care near the cliffs, Miss Hartwell. This estate has a way of losing women it treasures." She did not flinch. She simply closed the door behind her. That night, long after the candles had been snuffed and the halls had returned to shadow, Melody crept once more into the music room. The moonlight bathed the piano in silver, casting soft light across the floorboards. She opened a small drawer she had not noticed before. Inside, a journal, not letters, not notes, but daily entries written in Cecilia's hand. October the 9th, he came again. He says, "I must persuade Lucian to sign, that my husband listens to me more than I think. But Lucian no longer sleeps. He walks the house at night. I fear I'm losing him, or perhaps I'm already lost. I will leave, soon. I will take Eliza and go. I do not yet know where, but I know I must." Melody closed the book with trembling fingers. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs, and inside, the truth had begun to rise. The days grew longer, and yet the light inside Harrow House seemed to dim with each hour that passed. Outside, the estate prepared for the season's most anticipated gathering, a grand summer ball that would fill the marble halls with music, laughter, and the rustling silks of Newport's elite. But beneath the surface of polished silver and lace-trimmed invitations, something tense and fragile pulsed through the corridors, fragile as the thread of a silk hem about to tear. Melody felt it with every glance she received. Mrs. Pembroke watched her now with narrowed eyes, her words growing shorter, her approval harder to earn. Every task was met with scrutiny. The laundry she had folded to near perfection was refolded. The silver she had polished gleamed, yet was inspected twice. Her steps were tracked through the house, as if the mere sound of her presence was offence enough. Miss Davenport offered no such subtlety. She scolded Eliza for the smallest infraction, and though she did not raise her hand, her tongue carried blades. And always, her gaze found Melody whenever Eliza smiled too freely or asked to carry her tea to the parlour instead of drinking it alone in the schoolroom. "You indulge her too much," she hissed one morning in the corridor, her voice low but her meaning sharp. "You are a servant, not a mother." Melody had simply stared at her, unmoved. She would not ask permission to show kindness. But it was not just the staff who turned their gazes against her now. Mrs. Adelaide Morton, with her peacock-coloured gowns and pearl combs, had returned to Harrow House like a sovereign reclaiming a kingdom. Her presence was fragrant and forceful, her voice a velvet-covered blade. She addressed Melody only when necessary, and always with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I do hope the tea is not too strong this time," she said one afternoon, sipping without tasting. "Some of us are accustomed to delicacy." The insinuation hung in the air. Melody inclined her head and said nothing. Adelaide had grown more determined since Edgar's arrival, her efforts redoubled, her posture more possessive whenever Lucian entered the room. She spoke as though already mistress of the house, issuing suggestions rather than requests, calling on his past with familiarity no one had granted her. And yet Lucian did not seem moved. He remained courteous, yes, but something in him had changed. He watched more. He listened longer, and when he looked at Melody, he no longer looked through her. They had crossed only a few words since that moment in the library, yet something had settled between them, unsaid, unseen, but present, in the air, in the quiet. He would find her in a corridor, pause just long enough to create a silence charged with meaning, then move on. Once he had passed her in the conservatory and paused to ask if Eliza had eaten. His hand had brushed hers as she handed him a folded note. The touch lasted less than a second, but it lingered in Melody's skin for hours. In those moments, she felt the world tilt, not with fantasy, but with something deeper. Recognition, respect, perhaps even regret. He spoke little of his grief. But once, while standing in the drawing room, where the music room's door remained always closed, he had turned to her and said, "Do you believe some ghosts prefer to remain unspoken?" And she, folding linens at the time, had replied, "I believe some ghosts are only waiting to be heard." He had not spoken again, but his gaze had followed her as she left the room. Eliza, in the meantime, grew bolder. She sought Melody in quiet moments, nestled beside her in the gardens, walked by her side through the library. She laughed more now, though always in a hush, as though afraid the sound might vanish if too many heard it. When Lucian caught her skipping beside Melody on the back terrace, he had not scolded her. Instead, he had watched and said nothing. Then came the night of the ball. The house glistened with golden candlelight. The chandeliers blazed above polished floors. Musicians tuned their strings in the grand hall, and servants in formal livery stood in silent formation. Coaches arrived one after the other, and out of them poured women in embroidered gowns, men in tailored waistcoats, jewels glittering like stars, as the evening descended into glittering opulence. Melody had been assigned to serve in the East Wing, away from the grand reception rooms. But as she moved from corridor to corridor, she caught glimpses of the celebration, silk gliding down staircases, fans fluttering over whispered rumors, laughter echoing against marble. She passed by the great hall once and saw Adelaide Morton descend the staircase with one gloved hand resting lightly on Lucian's arm. She wore emerald silk and diamonds at her throat. She moved as though the night belonged to her. And Lucian, though poised and dignified, looked more like a statue than a man alive in his own home. Later, as the dancing commenced, Melody was called to carry refreshments to the upper gallery. She completed her task quickly and began her descent, only to feel suddenly a chill. Something was wrong. She could not name it, but she knew it with the certainty of the sea before a storm. She descended another flight of stairs, turned a corner, and found the schoolroom empty. Eliza was gone. She searched quickly, her steps no longer graceful but urgent. The gallery, the dining corridor, the cloakroom, nothing. Then she turned toward the west wing. The door to the music room was open. The candles inside had not been lit, but moonlight poured through the window in silver waves, and in the center of the room, standing still as a portrait, was Eliza. Her small hands clutched the edge of the piano. Her eyes were wide. Melody entered slowly, heart pounding. "Eliza?" The girl turned. Her lips trembled. "I wasn't supposed to hear it," she whispered, "but I did." Melody moved closer, knelt. "What did you hear?" Eliza looked down. "I was in the cloakroom, hiding. I didn't want to dance with anyone. Miss Davenport came in. Mr. Edgar came too. They didn't see me." Melody stilled. "What did they say?" Eliza's voice lowered. "They said this game had gone on long enough, that you were a problem, that the master needed reminding." Her chin wobbled. "They said it was time to end the maid's game." Melody felt the blood drain from her face. She gathered Eliza into her arms, holding her tightly. The girl trembled. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered. "You heard what was meant to be hidden. That takes courage." "I was scared." "So was I." Melody stood, taking Eliza's hand. She would not cry. Not tonight. Tonight, she had seen too clearly the price of kindness. She led the child back through the corridors, away from the flickering music, away from the watching eyes. But as they passed the upper landing, Lucian appeared, his brow furrowed, his breath short. "Eliza," he said. She ran to him, and he knelt to hold her. Melody stood at a distance. "She was in the music room," she said quietly. "She needed air." Lucian looked at her over Eliza's head. His eyes were not cold now. They were furious, but not with her. He stood, child in arms, and turned toward the stairs. "Bring me the governess," he said to the footman behind him, "and find Mr. Avery." Then he looked once more at Melody, and for the first time she saw not the widower, not the master of Harrow House, but the man, and she knew. This game would not end as quietly as it had begun. The rain began softly at first, like the trembling notes of an overture. By mid-afternoon it had turned steady and mournful, blanketing Harrow House in a silence more absolute than thunder. The sea vanished into a misty curtain, and the windows wept quietly beneath the weight of the storm. Melody moved through the west corridor with something cradled in her arms, something fragile, powerful and irreversible. The letters and Cecilia's journal were wrapped in linen, bound carefully with twine, as if the pages themselves might tremble free if not handled with reverence. Melody had not intended to bring them, but after Eliza's confession, after the threats whispered behind cloaks and fans, she could no longer let silence rule. The truth, however terrible, had to be spoken. Lucian Harrow had summoned her to the library once again. The fire was lit this time. It crackled low behind the iron grate, filling the room with the scent of cedar and old memory. He stood by the hearth, his figure stiff, arms crossed, the set of his jaw like stone, his black coat fit like armor, and his expression carried the unmistakable weight of sleeplessness. "You said there was something urgent," he began, his voice clipped and taut. Melody entered slowly, placing the bundle on the nearest table with both hands. She did not sit. She did not speak right away. Instead, she untied the twine. Lucian's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward. "What is this?" "Her words," Melody replied softly. He looked down. The envelope on top was the first Cecilia had written, the one marked July the 5th. His name was etched in the top right corner in his late wife's unmistakable hand. Lucian's jaw clenched. "You've been reading these?" "Yes," Melody said, "because no one else ever did." His eyes met hers, and for a moment there was nothing but fury. "You had no right to enter that room." "I had every right," she said quietly, steadily, "because your daughter was weeping outside it, and the rest of this house pretends it doesn't exist." "You went through my wife's things," he spat, stepping forward. "She was frightened, Lucian," Melody replied, her voice still calm. "She wrote those words with a shaking hand and no one to hear her, not even you." The name hit the air like thunder. Lucian flinched. "I know what it means to lose someone," she continued, her voice catching but firm. "But grief doesn't give us the right to bury the truth with them." He stood frozen. Then, with sudden force, he swept the first few letters into his hands and tore open the top one. His eyes devoured the page. Melody watched as the mask fell slowly from his face. Line by line, his brow tightened, his lips parted, closed, parted again. A muscle ticked at the edge of his jaw. He reached for the next letter, then the next. He read standing, unmoving, as if anchored to the pain unfurling in his hands. When he reached the journal, its spine worn, its pages filled with Cecilia's voice, he faltered. He sank into the leather armchair, the journal resting in his lap. A long silence passed. The only sound was the fire hissing softly in the grate, and the rain pressing its sorrow against the windows. Then Lucian whispered, more to himself than to her. "I didn't know." Melody stepped closer, careful not to interrupt the moment that had opened like a wound. "She tried to protect you," she said, "but she was afraid." His hands gripped the journal tighter. "She never said a word, because she thought she had to bear it alone." His voice was raw. "She thought I wouldn't believe her." Melody's heart ached. "She thought she would destroy you if she spoke." Lucian looked up, and there, in the silence that followed, she saw him break. Not loudly, not violently, but in the slow collapse of a man who had spent too many years building walls no one dared to breach. His head bowed, his shoulders folded inward, his hand covered his eyes, and his breath hitched once. Then again, he wept without shame. Melody did not move, she did not speak. She simply stood nearby, a presence without expectation. And somehow, that was what he needed. When he finally rose, the journal still in hand, he turned to her, not as master to maid, not as accuser to trespasser, but as a man stripped bare. "Come with me," he said. The words were soft, hoarse. She followed him through the corridors, through the hush of evening shadows, to the one place the household had long left untouched, the music room. Lucian opened the door himself. No key, no hesitation. The hinges groaned in protest, as if shocked by use. He stepped inside and inhaled deeply, as though breathing in a past he had once feared would consume him. The room was exactly as Melody had left it. The dust, the piano, the unfinished portrait above the fireplace. Lucian crossed to the instrument. His hand, broad and precise, traced the edge of the lid. Then slowly, he lifted it. The keys, ivory and ebony, gleamed under the golden wash of the oil lamp he had brought. He sat. For a long moment, he simply stared at the keys. Then, with a breath that shook loose years of silence, he played. The melody was soft, hesitant, a lullaby wrapped in memory, the kind Cecilia might once have played for their daughter when the wind howled and the walls ached. From the doorway, Melody watched, and then another figure appeared, Eliza. Barefoot in her nightgown, her hair tumbling down her back, she approached the room as if stepping into a dream she barely remembered. Lucian looked up. He did not speak. He did not scold. Eliza stepped forward and reached the piano. She placed her small hand on a single key and pressed it, just once. A note, clear and innocent, answered her. She looked at her father, and he looked at her. Tears glistened in both their eyes. Melody stepped back, leaving them alone. Later that night, when the house had gone still and the storm began to break, Melody lit a lantern and walked through the back garden to the estate's solicitor's quarters. She had asked to see him earlier that week, quietly, without explanation. Now, she handed him the bundle of documents, each page carefully numbered, each envelope sealed again. He reviewed them beneath the flickering lamplight, adjusting his spectacles with increasing tension. "Handwriting matches," he murmured. "The dates align with company transactions. These aren't just personal. They're evidence, binding." He looked up at her. "These are damning, Miss Hartwell. Legally and morally." Melody nodded once. "I thought so. Do you intend to use them?" "I believe the master will." The solicitor considered her. "And you? What will you do?" She looked out toward the looming silhouette of Harrow House, its towers cloaked in mist and moonlight. "I'll stay," she said, "until the truth is louder than the silence ever was." The man said nothing. He only bowed his head. And when Melody walked back through the damp grass, her skirts trailing moisture, she felt the earth shifting beneath her feet, not like a collapse, but like a garden beginning to stir. Inside the house, the piano still echoed softly, and for the first time in years, Harrow House no longer felt asleep. The morning unfolded under a sky too still for comfort. The air was heavy, as if the clouds above Harrow House carried not rain, but something more volatile, something waiting to fall. The sea below, usually in motion, had quieted to a glassy, menacing calm, its surface hiding tempests beneath. Inside, The walls of the great house pulsed with secrets about to rupture. Lucian had risen early, earlier than the staff, earlier even than the light. Alone in the study, he spread Cecilia's letters and journal across the desk, the candlelight flickering over the ink that now burned with truth. His hands, strong and steady, trembled slightly as he reviewed the documentation the solicitor had confirmed. The accusations were no longer rumor, they were fact, etched in his late wife's hand, dated and admissible. His brother-in-law, Edgar Avery, had not only manipulated Cecilia, but exploited his grief, embedding himself in Harrow's accounts, twisting influence into control. Today would be the reckoning. But before he could summon Edgar to face what could no longer be denied, the house betrayed him once more. It began with a scream. Melody was polishing the silver in the morning parlour when Annie, the youngest maid, burst in, her eyes wide, her face pale. "They're in your room, Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Pembroke and Miss Davenport with the footman. They're saying something was found." Melody rose, heart stilling. By the time she reached her room in the attic, a small crowd had gathered. Maids clutching aprons, a butler shifting uncomfortably in the doorway, and Mrs. Pembroke standing squarely at the foot of the narrow bed. On the quilted coverlet sat a jewellery box, small, velvet-lined, its clasp broken open. Inside glittered pieces no maid could mistake for imitation: a sapphire brooch, a pearl drop earring, a diamond hairpin. Melody stared. She had never seen them before in her life. "I found them in the back of the wardrobe," Mrs. Pembroke said, not looking at her, "concealed beneath folded linens." "I didn't put them there," Melody said, her voice calm, too calm. "Those aren't mine." "You expect us to believe that?" Miss Davenport chimed in, arms crossed. "A girl from the coast, no name, no connections, suddenly rising in favour with the master?" "She's been alone with the child, alone with the master," Pembroke added, each word sharper than the last. "And now we find jewels missing from the guest wing. These were part of Mrs. Morton's collection." A murmur rippled through the servants gathered. Melody said nothing, not because she lacked words, but because she understood the stage had been prepared too carefully for protest to matter. Then Lucian entered. His presence, as always, quieted the room with immediate force. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, voice low. Mrs. Pembroke turned, her face folded into an expression of disappointed duty. "We've found stolen property in Miss Hartwell's quarters, sir. I thought it best to bring it to your attention directly." Lucian's gaze shifted to the box, then to Melody. She did not flinch. "I didn't take them," she said. "I've never entered the guest wing without orders." His jaw tightened. "It was hidden, sir," Pembroke pressed. "In the back of her wardrobe. She must have thought no one would look there." Lucian was silent, and for a moment, an unbearable moment, Melody saw it. Doubt. It flickered behind his eyes like a candle fighting wind. And though he did not step toward her, though he did not raise his voice, his silence was louder than thunder. Melody lifted her chin. "If you believe I would steal from this house," she said, her voice steady, "then I have nothing left to prove." And then, from the staircase, came a smaller voice. "I saw him." Every head turned. Eliza, in her morning gown, stood with her hands clasped tightly before her. "I couldn't sleep last night. I was going to ask Melody for a story," she said softly. "I saw Mr. Avery come out of her room. He had something in his hand. A box." Lucian's breath caught. "What time was this?" he asked gently. "Late," she whispered. "The hall candle was almost out." Mrs. Pembroke's face blanched. Miss Davenport turned red. Melody looked at Eliza, stunned, but the child's gaze did not waver. She stood firm, though her lip trembled. Lucian turned to the crowd. "Leave us." The room emptied in silence. When it was only the three of them, Lucian walked to the bed. He picked up the jewellery box, inspected the broken clasp. "I should have known," he murmured. "I should have seen it coming." He looked at Melody then, and what she saw in his face was not only apology. It was pain, deep, human, regret laced with something else she couldn't name. "Thank you," she said quietly to Eliza, her voice cracking. The girl stepped forward and took Melody's hand. That evening, the estate bloomed with dusk. Lanterns were lit along the garden paths, and the fog rolled in soft and slow. Melody stood at the edge of the orangery, watching as the lamps flickered through the glass. Then she saw Edgar Avery. He was walking with Eliza, alone. His hand rested on the girl's shoulder, guiding her with too much familiarity, too much confidence. Melody's heart seized. She moved quickly, almost running through the hedges, her skirts catching on thorns, the dampness of the ground soaking through her shoes. She caught sight of them again, heading toward the cliffs. "Eliza!" The girl turned, startled. Edgar froze. "Come to see the sea," he said smoothly. "It's a lovely view this time of—" "Let her go," Melody said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Eliza, wide-eyed, stepped away from him. Then the ground shifted. A soft cracking sound, like paper torn slowly. The edge of the cliff, worn by weeks of hidden erosion, began to give. Melody acted without thought. She lunged forward, grabbing Eliza by the waist just as the earth crumbled beneath them. The child screamed. Melody twisted her body to shield her, her arms wrapped tightly as they fell backward onto safer ground. The cliffside gave way entirely behind them, crashing into the sea with a roar that shook the birds from the trees. Silence followed. Then voices, footsteps. Lucian arrived, breathless, coat open, his eyes wild. He fell to his knees beside them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, hands hovering over Eliza, then Melody. "I'm all right," Melody breathed. "Eliza's safe." The child clung to her. More people arrived. Servants, guests, even Mrs. Morton, pale and furious. Someone shouted about Edgar, but he was already gone, disappeared into the gathering fog like a ghost. Lucian helped them both to their feet. His hand stayed at Melody's waist longer than necessary. When their eyes met, the emotion that passed between them was quiet and seismic. No one spoke of propriety. No one dared. That night, as the house reeled from the near tragedy, a new silence settled. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the hush before a storm changes direction. And this time, the wind was on Melody's side. The salt air carried a different weight now. It no longer pressed upon Harrow House like a warning, but drifted in soft currents through open windows, ushering in a quiet the mansion had not known in years. There was a stillness, yes, but it was no longer the hush of grief or fear. It was the silence that follows a reckoning. Melody lay in her small bed beneath the eaves, the bruises along her ribs already beginning to fade, though they pulsed faintly each time she drew in a breath. The ache in her shoulder, too, was sharp but healing. Her skin bore the memory of the fall, the dirt, the panic, but her heart strangely did not tremble. It beat steady, it beat strong. For days now, she had heard the rhythm of change unfolding below her, carried on footsteps no longer muffled by dread. Mrs. Pembroke was gone, dismissed without ceremony, her keys taken, her quarters vacated by morning, her scowl, her rigid silence, her cold authority, erased like chalk from slate. Miss Davenport had not fared better. Though she had wept when confronted with the accusations, Eliza's testimony, Melody's calm account, Lucian's quiet fury, she had not begged to stay. She had packed in the dark and left without saying goodbye. The other servants at first were cautious. The lines between master and maid did not shift easily, but in the days that followed something softened. Orders were still given, duties still performed, but the invisible weight, the fear of a wrong glance, a misplaced word, began to dissolve. At the heart of it stood Lucian Harrow. He moved through the halls now with a quieter purpose, not diminished, no. The dignity remained, but it was no longer armor. It was something else, something earned. On the third morning, he summoned the household to the front parlor. Melody was helped to a chair near the window. Eliza sat beside her, small hand folded tightly into hers. When Lucian entered, all turned to face him. He stood tall, a document in one hand, his solicitor at his side. His eyes moved across the room, pausing on Melody only briefly, but the pause was deep, filled with a gravity that needed no words. "What I say today," he began, "concerns not just this house, but the name it carries. Harrow is a name built on legacy, but legacy without integrity is a hollow inheritance." He lifted the papers. "For months, Mr. Edgar Avery, trusted as both family and advisor, has used that trust to manipulate, embezzle, and coerce. These documents," he held them aloft, "contain proof of forged agreements, personal threats made against my late wife, and financial dealings that would have placed this estate and its workers in irreversible danger." A murmur rippled through the staff. Some gasped. Others simply stared. Lucian continued, voice steady. "He will no longer have any association with Harrow House, Harrow Shipping, or my family. His access is revoked, his holdings returned, his influence ended." There was a pause. The fire crackled in the hearth. "And it is thanks to Miss Melody Hartwell," he said, turning toward her, "that these truths came to light." Every eye followed his gaze. Melody's breath caught, but she did not look away. "She read what others feared to see," he said. "She acted when others chose silence, and she risked everything, not for gain, but for truth." He turned to the room. "This house will change, starting now." The meeting ended without applause. But when Melody rose to return to her room, the staff parted silently to let her pass. No one whispered, no one sneered, some even nodded. Later that afternoon, Adelaide Morton arrived. She came unannounced, as always, trailing silk and scandal behind her like perfume. Her eyes, ever sharp, scanned the house as if expecting ruin. But there was no decay. The chandeliers sparkled. The staff stood tall. Even the doorman, who had once bowed so deeply, barely inclined his head. Lucian received her in the crimson parlour. Melody did not hear the entire exchange, but she heard enough. "She is a maid," Adelaide said coldly, her voice like glass about to crack. "A servant. The city is already whispering." "I know," Lucian replied, calm as stone, "and they're whispering in her favour. Do you think this will end well for you, standing beside someone so ordinary?" Melody paused outside the door. Lucian's reply was low but clear. "Ordinary people are the ones who do extraordinary things when no one expects them to," Adelaide scoffed. "So that's it? You choose her over every name, every alliance, every door open to you in this city?" "I choose the truth," he said, "and I choose what brings light into this house, not what keeps it gilded and hollow." A pause, then footsteps, sharp, final. The door flung open, and Adelaide swept past Melody without a word, her chin high, her pride punctured beyond repair. That evening, the sky burned with the colours of late summer. Amber, rose, gold. A hush fell across the estate, one of peace this time, not foreboding. The staff dined earlier than usual, and laughter, soft, tentative, echoed from the servants' quarters. Melody stood at the threshold of the music room. The door was open. For the first time, the shutters were drawn wide. The breeze stirred the lace curtains. The piano's surface had been dusted, its keys gleaming like the moon across the sea. The unfinished portrait of Cecilia remained, but even it seemed less mournful now, less abandoned. Melody stepped inside. She did not cross to the piano. Not yet. She walked to the window, resting her hand on the frame, watching the horizon blur with twilight. Then came a sound, not loud, not deliberate, a note, the piano's voice, hesitant but true. Melody turned. Lucian sat at the bench. He wore no coat. His cravat hung loose. His hair, slightly ruffled by the breeze, softened the lines of his face. He did not look at her as he played. He let the melody speak instead. It was not a mournful tune, not this time. It was uncertain, tender, with pauses for breath. A song of beginning, not of ending. Melody crossed the room, slowly. She stood beside the piano, one hand resting on the edge. Lucian looked up at last. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd leave the door open," she replied. His eyes, always grey, now shimmered with something else. Not sorrow, not guilt, something gentler. "You brought light back into this room," he said. "You brought her back to me. Not just Cecilia. Eliza. Myself." Melody shook her head. "You brought yourself back." He lowered his gaze. "I never deserved forgiveness." "You never asked for it," she said. "You carried silence like a burden, not a shield." He rose from the bench, slow, careful, as if afraid the moment might shatter. They stood a breath apart, not touching, not needing to. "You've changed this house," he said. She answered with quiet strength. "I only reminded it how to breathe again." Lucian's hand rose, not to take hers, but to rest gently over her heart. Just above it, not pressing, simply feeling its rhythm. They stood that way for a long moment, surrounded by fading music, and the memory of sorrow turned into something new. When Melody returned to her chamber that night, the sea no longer sounded like a warning, it sounded like a lullaby. The sun rose like a hush over the cliffs of Newport, casting pale gold across the sea and warming the dew-laced glass of Harrow House. Morning came softer now. The great windows no longer seemed like eyes that stared into emptiness. They watched instead with quiet hope. The music room, once sealed in silence and sorrow, had changed. Its shutters were now drawn open each morning, letting in the sound of gulls and the far-off sigh of waves. Dust had been banished, the draperies freshened. A vase of blush roses sat atop the piano. The unfinished portrait of Cecilia remained on the wall, still ghost-like in its incompletion, but no longer burdened by shadow. Melody stood in that room, her hands folded in front of her, as though waiting for something she dared not name. Lucian entered without announcement. He carried no cane, no gloves, no armor of stature. Only a small, velvet-covered box rested in his palm. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her, really looked, and she felt the air shift. "I thought this room had taken everything from me," he said softly, "but I was wrong. It was waiting to give something back." She turned to face him, eyes wide. Lucian stepped forward, his gaze not wavering. "You came into this house with nothing but a suitcase and a name I didn't know. And now I cannot take a single step in these halls without feeling your presence in every corner." Melody swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Lucian," he opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, gleamed a ring of delicate gold, worn, loved, familiar. A single sapphire sat at its center, flanked by two small diamonds. It was not new, it was not grand, but it shimmered with meaning. Before Melody could speak, another figure slipped silently into the room. Eliza. Her small hands cradled something wrapped in linen. With solemn care, she stepped between them and unwrapped the bundle to reveal the very same ring. "This one," she said with quiet conviction. "Mama's ring. It's yours now." Melody's breath caught. Eliza reached up and took Melody's hand. "Mama would want you to wear it." Tears welled in Melody's eyes, not from grief, but from something deeper, more profound. A kind of grace she had never dared to hope for. Lucian knelt, not in ceremony but in reverence. "Will you marry me, Melody Hartwell?" he asked, voice breaking slightly. "Not to quiet the gossip, not to appease anyone, but because you have given me something I thought I'd buried myself." She couldn't speak. Her heart swelled so full it felt it might burst. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, and whispered, "Yes." Lucian rose and kissed her hand with such tenderness that her knees weakened. Eliza threw her arms around them both, and for the first time in years, the music room was filled not with secrets or shadows, but with laughter. The days that followed unfolded like a second spring. Lucian, true to his promise, began changing the tone of the entire household. The staff, once cowed by Mrs. Pembroke's reign, now walked with lightened steps. Cook was given her own kitchen garden again. The footmen were allowed their evening hours back. Even Mr. Potts, the gruff gardener, began singing off-key as he trimmed the hedges. Melody, though still addressed as Miss Hartwell among the staff, was no longer an invisible maid. Her presence was no longer questioned, but quietly respected. She dined beside Eliza in the mornings, arranged flowers in the parlour, and supervised the reopening of the library, a task she undertook with both joy and trembling reverence. And yet, not all hearts were softened by joy. It arrived on crisp cream stationery, sealed with a gilded insignia, bearing the scent of rosewater and disdain. The invitation to the season's closing gala had arrived for Lucian Harrow, but not for his fiancée. The note, unsigned but unmistakably penned by the ladies of the Newport Society Club, bore the words with chilling precision. "We regret to inform you that Miss Melody Hartwell's presence would not be appropriate at the closing gala. We trust your understanding of our standards and traditions." Lucian read it aloud in the library, the paper shaking between his fingers. "They dare," he muttered, "they dare insult you after all you've done for this house, after all you've endured." Melody stood by the window, watching the sun glint off the sea. She didn't answer immediately. Her hands remained still at her sides. "I'm not surprised," she said softly at last. Lucian turned, his voice tight. "But I am. I thought, after Adelaide's disgrace, after the truth came out, they would have learned." She shook her head. "They didn't learn. They regrouped." He crossed the room to her. "I'll decline the invitation. I'll call them out publicly if I must." "No," Melody said gently. She turned to face him. "You will go." Lucian's brow furrowed. "Without you? Never." "You'll go," she repeated, her voice serene. "And I will decide for myself whether I wish to attend, not to prove myself to anyone, but to remind myself that I belong wherever I choose to stand." He stared at her, something fierce and tender warring in his eyes. "You don't have to fight any more, Melody," he said quietly. "But I want to," she replied. "Not for them. For me." Outside, Eliza chased butterflies through the garden, her pale curls bouncing in the light. The world had not changed overnight, but it had begun to turn. That evening, Melody returned to the summer room. She sat at the piano bench, not to play, but to think. The unfinished portrait watched her. Cecilia's eyes, half-painted, seemed less sorrowful now, as though they too had found peace. Melody lifted the lid of the piano, ran her fingers across the keys, and struck a single note. It rang clear, pure. She did not fear the whispers anymore. She had lived beneath their weight. Now she stood above them. Later that night, as the house slept and the sea shimmered beneath a half-moon sky, Melody held the ring in her palm, the same ring that had belonged to a woman silenced by secrets. A woman whose daughter now laughed freely, a woman whose husband had dared, at last, to let go of ghosts. Melody slipped the ring onto her finger and held her hand to her heart, not as a symbol of status, but of promise, to never again lower her gaze, to never again question her worth, and to stand always as the woman who saw the truth and chose love anyway. The carriages lined Bellevue Avenue like polished beetles gleaming under gaslight. Newport's elite had descended upon the Grand Opera House in silks and whispers, adorned in diamonds and discretion, their every movement choreographed for admiration. But none shone brighter than the woman who stepped from the Harrow carriage just past 8 o'clock. Melody Hartwell paused at the threshold. The air was thick with perfume and judgment. The doorman, trained to school his features, faltered when his eyes met hers. A hush rippled through the steps, subtle but unmistakable. On her arm stood Lucian Harrow, tall, composed and breathtaking in his evening coat of deep black wool, his cravat knotted in classic Valois style, his silver-touched hair brushed neatly back. He did not glance at the crowd. His gaze remained fixed, only on her. Melody wore sapphire silk that kissed her skin with every step. The gown, tailored in Parisian lines and stitched with fine beadwork at the bodice, hugged her form with graceful confidence. Her shoulders were bare beneath the soft folds of a midnight blue shawl. Her dark hair had been swept up into a chignon of intricate loops held by silver pins, with a single tendril trailing along her cheek. At her ears, pearls shimmered, not ostentatiously, but with quiet elegance. She looked ahead, not down. Inside, chandeliers blazed with light. Murmurs fluttered like restless wings as society turned to assess, calculate, condemn, or admire. The whispers were swift. She's the maid. He brought her here. To this. But look at her. Like she was born to it. Some faces recoiled in silent disdain. Others softened, uncertain. One or two offered hesitant nods. Melody did not flinch. She did not falter. Her arm looped through Lucian's. She ascended the red-carpeted staircase as though she had always belonged. In the private box overlooking the velvet-draped stage, Eliza waited. The child rose at once, hands pressed to the railing, her white gloves wrinkling. She was radiant in a sky-blue dress trimmed in lace, her hair curled and tied with satin ribbon. Her joy, untouched by propriety, danced in her eyes the moment she saw Melody. "You look like a queen," she whispered when they joined her. Lucian smiled and touched Eliza's shoulder. "She is." Melody said nothing. Her voice had lodged in her chest. She took her seat between father and daughter, the very place that had once been Cecilia's. Yet tonight there was no ghost. No shadow, only light and breath and the quiet rhythm of three hearts learning to beat together. The curtain rose. The opera began, Puccini's Manon Lescaut, a tale of tragedy and passion. The voices soared, the violins cried. The story of a woman lost to love and circumstance unfolded beneath golden lights, and Melody sat, unmoved by the tragedy on stage, because her own story had defied it. When the final notes lingered in the air like a dying flame, the applause thundered. Eliza clapped with abandon, cheeks flushed with excitement. Lucian rose to help Melody to her feet. As they exited the box, the audience below turned. This time, the hush was louder. This time, there were no whispered insults, only stares. Melody did not offer them a smile. She did not offer them anything at all. She simply looked up, and they looked back. Not at a maid, not at an impostor, at a woman. Back at Harrow House, the night air was cool and fragrant. The staff, alerted of their return, had left the gaslights on in the entrance and a tray of warm tea in the drawing room. But Lucian bypassed both. He took Melody's hand in silence and led her to the music room. There, the moonlight spilled across the floor in silver slants. The piano, once cloaked in dust and sorrow, gleamed with promise. The portrait still hung on the far wall, but the paint no longer whispered grief. It had faded gently into memory. Lucian paused beside the instrument. He opened the velvet box once more. The ring, Cecilia's ring, now Melody's, rested inside. He lifted it with reverence, his hands steady. "This time," he said softly, "I don't offer it as a question." Melody's breath caught. "This time I offer it as a celebration of everything you've endured, everything you've become, and everything we will build." She extended her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger, the sapphire catching the moonlight like a tiny star. They said nothing for several heartbeats. Silence at last was not emptiness, it was peace. Eliza appeared in the doorway barefoot, her nightgown trailing like mist around her ankles. "Is it over?" she asked. Melody turned, smiling. "Only the beginning, sweetheart." The little girl tiptoed across the room and curled up on the settee near the window, watching them. "You looked beautiful. Everyone looked at you." "I know," Melody said gently. "And I wasn't afraid." Lucian crossed to the piano. He sat, flexed his fingers, and began to play, not a requiem, not a dirge, a waltz, light, full of hope. Melody stepped into the room's center, turned slowly, letting the notes guide her. Lucian met her eyes across the music, and he smiled. Outside, the sea rolled against the cliffs, eternal and restless, but within the walls of Harrow House, a stillness had settled, Not the silence of grief or fear, but the quiet of something whole. Melody walked to the window. Her reflection met her gaze. She saw no servant, no girl clawing her way through rejection. She saw a woman who had stood in the face of disdain, injustice, and cruelty, and had not lowered her eyes. A woman who had loved without shame, who had refused to remain invisible, who had at last been seen. In the distance, the opera house still glimmered on the horizon, but its lights were fading. The real performance, the true transformation, had taken place here, in a room once filled with shadows, now radiant with life. The music swelled, and Melody Hartwell, no longer just the maid, no longer the girl at the edge of the sea, closed her eyes, placed her hand on her heart, and danced. The ocean had not changed. It still whispered secrets to the cliffs, still painted the shoreline with white foam and longing. But Harrow House, once stiff with silence and shadows, had learned to breathe. 8 summers had passed since the night Melody Hartwell stood in the Newport Opera House and claimed her place, not with defiance but with grace. 8 summers since Lucian Harrow slipped Cecilia's ring onto her finger, not to ask, but to celebrate. The house no longer hushed its corners in fear. Laughter had carved paths where grief once lingered. The music room, now known among the locals as the summer room, stood open year-round. Its windows caught the morning sun, and its piano rarely rested, played by small hands, large hands, and hands joined in duet. Melody stood on the veranda, her hair pinned loosely at the nape, touched by silver at the temples. The breeze tugged at her linen skirts. In her arms, she held a sleeping boy, cheeks sun-kissed, fingers curled tight, no more than 2 years old. His name was Thomas, though Lucian often called him my second miracle. Inside, a giggle rang out, then another. Eliza, now 16, was chasing her little sister around the parlour, her long skirts tucked up and her braids bouncing. The girl squealed in delight. Sophie was 4 and utterly untamable. Eliza, who had once hidden behind silence, now spoke with warmth and wit. Her voice was her own, a melody that had taken years to rise, but now filled the house without fear. She still played piano every morning before breakfast, as her mother once had, but the sorrow in her music had been replaced with joy, with memory, with growth. Lucian emerged from the orchard path, taller than ever, streaks of grey in his beard, now matching the stormy blue of his eyes. He carried a basket of apples in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. "For you," he said, kissing Melody's brow as he placed the bouquet on the table beside her. "For all of us," she replied, brushing a kiss onto the sleeping boy's forehead. He smiled, his eyes scanning the scene. Eliza and Sophie tumbling across a quilt, the house gleaming behind them, the sea stretching out in approval. "We built this," Lucian murmured. "Yes," Melody said softly, "out of nothing but ruin and truth." There had been hardships, of course. Edgar Avery had returned once, bitter, gaunt, and burned by scandal, but the evidence stood firm, and society no longer shielded men like him. He died in Paris 2 years later, alone and without title, his debts deeper than his regrets. As for Adelaide Morton, she married a shipping magnate 10 years her junior, who paraded her at galas but left her name out of his estate. Melody had seen her once at a charity luncheon, face taut, eyes exhausted. She did not look up. Miss Davenport, dismissed from Harrow House in disgrace, found employment far from Newport, in a girls' boarding school in Maine. It was said she grew softer over time, or lonelier. And Mrs. Pembroke? No one quite knew, but Melody never sought their stories. She had her own. She and Lucian had travelled, Savannah, Lisbon, Venice. Each time they returned, Harrow House felt more like home. They had opened a school in town for girls who had once been ignored, like Melody once was. The Harrow Hartwell Foundation now funded scholarships for daughters of servants, widows, and sailors lost at sea. The town had changed too. Newport society, once rigid and cruel, could no longer ignore the tides. Names that once dictated doors now whispered from dusty ledgers, while new voices, stronger, bolder, rose in music halls, classrooms and town squares. Melody placed the boy in his cradle, covered him with a quilt, and joined Lucian beneath the arbor, where the roses bloomed wild and unrepentant. He took her hand. Her wedding ring, now worn smooth at the edges, still shone in the light. "Do you ever miss who we were back then?" she asked. "No," he answered, "because we still are, just more." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Together, they listened to Eliza's laughter, Sophie's delight, and the wind that never stopped singing. The sea would carry their story beyond the cliffs, past time itself, but the love born in the silence of Harrow House, forged in grief, defiance, and unspoken need, that love had endured, not as legend, but as life. Every story leaves a trace, but some, like melodies, leave a mark that time cannot erase. From a quiet maid at the edge of the sea to a woman who dared to look up in a world that tried to keep her small, Melody taught us that true strength is not loud. It is patient, persistent, and full of love. That healing is possible even in a house built on silence, and that when we choose to see others with compassion instead of judgment, lives can change forever. This was more than a romance. It was a journey through grief, courage, and the quiet rebellion of a woman who knew her worth. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, if it reminded you of the power of resilience and love, leave us a comment below. We would be honored to know your thoughts. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word "summer room" in the comments. That way, we'll know you were truly part of this journey with us, right until the final note. If you'd like to support the team that brings these emotional tales to life, consider sending us a super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount your heart allows. Every bit helps us create more stories like this one, and if that's not possible for now, no worries. Just sharing this video with someone who loves period dramas as much as you do is already a beautiful gift. And don't forget, I'm leaving a few hand-picked stories in the cards above. If you loved this one, I believe those will speak to your heart too. Thank you for walking through the halls of Harrow House with us. May you carry its music in your heart for a long, long time.